What's up, nerds? Russia may be preparing for yet another counteroffensive. This follows, of course, Vladimir Putin's recent re-election in Russia, and I want to discuss what exactly might happen now that the election is over and what we could expect from a potential Russian offensive. Now, first and foremost, Russia had to get these elections out of the way first. Not that these elections were necessarily close. I mean, Vladimir Putin won the elections with 87% of the vote, which, good for him, great success. However, they had to make sure that Putin had officially sworn in for his next term before any kind of significant political decision like another mobilization would happen. And that takes us to what Russia would need to accomplish before they can launch another round of offensives, and that would be another round of mobilization. Now, this is expected sometime soon. This has been discussed amongst some of the intelligence agencies publicly for a number of months now. But now that the election is over, it is expected that, okay, this is the next thing that's going to happen in Russia. They're going to launch another round of mobilization. This is necessary for the Russian military, not only because of losses that they've sustained in previous offensives, but also to relieve troops that might be exhausted along the front line, especially those in areas like around Avdiivka that might be exhausted from previous offensives. Now, the reason that they had to do this after the election is because mobilization is not particularly popular. We're going to talk a little bit about later in this video about how Ukraine might need to launch another round of mobilization itself, and that itself is also a very politically polarizing topic in Ukraine. But in Russia, it's the same kind of issue, where it is a politically challenging issue to approach, and that Russia has to be kind of careful politically with when it launches its mobilization, specifically with right after the election. However, this will have to happen for Russia to be able to, in any kind of way, vastly overmatch the Ukrainian military in numbers when attacking. For example, whenever we've seen Russia launch attacks previously in this war, like say in Bakhmut or Avdiivka, Russia has sustained significant casualties. During the Battle of Avdiivka, Ukraine claimed that Russia had lost over 47,000 troops killed or wounded. And that figure is almost certainly exaggerated, so the true number is probably somewhere beneath that number. However, British intelligence has stated that Russia may have lost over 400 tanks in this attack. So certainly significant losses just to take this one town. I mean, it was a very well fortified and heavily contested city since the 2014 invasion. So, of course, that was going to be a bloody fight. But it's not just in Avdiivka. We look at the Battle of Bakhmut, which lasted many months, and it's estimated that Russia lost somewhere around 20,000 soldiers killed, with around 80,000 wounded in and around Bakhmut. Now, the majority of those losses were Wagner fighters. However, of course, we all know Wagner doesn't exist anymore, so now this is all, reliant on the Russian military proper to carry out these attacks. Russia is having to rely on persistent infantry assaults due to a lack of equipment and really shortages of equipment when attacking. However, that being said, these attacks are becoming more and more successful, and we can look at Avdiivka, how they're becoming more successful due to the lack of ammunition on the Ukrainian side. Without U.S. aid and with kind of the slow rolling of aid from Europe, Ukraine is becoming increasingly more challenged to defend its positions against persistent Russian attacks, even though they're attacking over open terrain and dismounted infantry formations, and Ukraine is fortified. Simply put, if you don't have the ammunition, you're just going to have a difficult time defending in either way. RUSI estimates that the Russian strength in Ukraine right now is somewhere around 470,000 troops. Russia has quietly continued its mobilization from previous years, according to ISW as well. They've also augmented their recruitment pool with foreign fighters through different kinds of recruitment schemes. For instance, they will offer citizenship for military service, but there have also been different kinds of recruitment scams that have come to light where foreign people looking for work in Russia end up being recruited into the Russian military unsuspectingly. Of course, right now the Russian military is targeting a 1.5 million soldier recruitment goal. They may not be able to reach that goal, but they certainly should get close to that goal, and that will give them significant combat strength, at least in terms of personnel, once they're able to reach that number. Of course, right now it's estimated that Ukraine's current combat strength is around 800,000 soldiers with over 1 million in reserve. We talk about the often cited NATO doctrine of whenever you're attacking of how you need a 3-to-1 ratio of attackers to defenders, so 3 attackers for every 1 defender. This can be achieved at a local or even an operational level by Russia with another mobilization and by simply massing troops in areas where they plan to attack and then doing so. And we've seen them do that, and we've seen Ukraine do the same thing during their counteroffensive along parts of the front line. Now, in either case, Russia has had fire superiority over Ukraine all over the front line through artillery. This isn't just because of ammunition, which Russia has been able to gain more ammunition through deals with North Korea and Iran, but Ukraine's also had challenges obtaining ammunition because really the Western defense industrial base just cannot keep up with the amount of consumption that this war has demanded. We've also seen the Russian Air Force increase its efficiency and effectiveness through the use of FAB glide bombs, and we've talked about that in a previous video as well. With all of this being stated, Russia hasn't even changed its overall goals for the war, at least publicly. Their stated goal in Ukraine is to overturn the government in Kiev and turn it pro-Russian. And they want to convert Ukraine basically into a buffer zone against NATO. Now, those are the goals. We've already stated the current combat strengths between the two countries and what Russia needs to do. What Ukraine's currently doing right now is they're working on building stronger and stronger defensive lines. We've seen images and videos coming out of work being done to really prepare Ukrainian defensive lines for what they expect to be a pretty strong Russian offensive, coming into this year. This is an important step, but at the same time, like I've already said, ammunition is incredibly important and it is required. We've seen the Czech initiative to get Ukraine over 800,000 artillery shells, and that could not have come at a better time. Ukraine has to have those shells like yesterday, and so those could be a huge benefit in repelling large-scale Russian attacks. We've also seen Ukraine increase its production of small drones, and that those have become an incredible asset when targeting dismounted infantry. However, Ukraine also needs other forms of ammunition as well. For instance, air defense ammunition has become a critical issue logistically for Ukraine because they're having a hard time defending against FABs, cruise missiles, Russian jets and helicopters, those kinds of things, without air defense munitions. Now, there was a recent U.S. aid package that came through. It was relatively small, but it included a lot of munitions in it. And that is just enough to help Ukraine get by for now. It is certainly not going to be very helpful for them long term. Longer term, and bigger scaled, aid packages need to be done here in the United States and in Europe. And those need to be implemented incredibly quickly to make sure that Ukraine will have the ammunition that it'll need to defend itself. Now, where could the next Russian offensive begin? There are a few areas that I believe that Russia is really priming itself for an attack, and here's kind of where I think that they could launch these attacks and what their objectives may be. The first, of course, is going to be north in Luhansk. We've got the 1st Guards Tank Army, which has reconstituted itself and is kind of arrayed along this front line. The 41st and the 20th Combined Arms Armies are also in this area, and this is all, of course, according to Deep State Map. Now, these forces could attack in the north towards Kupiansk, as well as south towards the Oskil River. Now, this would be an attempt to cut the supply lines for Ukrainian forces to the east of the Oskil River. This would create a significant dilemma for those forces east of the river and either force them to fall back to the west of the river or really just put them in a very, very challenging position. Now, this could also follow another attack south of the Oskil River towards Liman. And this, again, continues to kind of put those Ukrainian troops east of the river in a significant dilemma, cutting off supply lines, putting those supply lines under fire control to the point that, they're going to have to either cross the river or use whatever land route is still available to get out. Now, this is a pretty significant chunk of territory as well. And this is, an area that had been retaken by Ukraine following the Kharkiv offensive. So this would be a pretty significant impact, I think, if Ukraine were to lose this area. I don't think that this would, prelude a massive collapse along the front line, but certainly, the Oskil River is a geographic feature that could be an objective for the Russians here in this area. Of course, we've got west of Bakhmut, where fighting has continued since Bakhmut fell to the Russians. Russia could be interested in pushing forward towards Chasiv Yar and ultimately Konstantinivka. And again, similar kind of situation. This would challenge Ukrainian logistics along the eastern part of the front line. Russia could also push west of Avdiivka. And in this area, I've seen from different sources that Russian forces might be exhausted. However, again, with the mobilization, they can reconstitute those forces fairly quickly, get new soldiers in that area, reconstitute the forces that had taken Avdiivka, and then they can continue to push forward. They would likely be interested in the city of Pokrovsk, which is, again, a major logistics node that supplies Ukrainian forces along the eastern and southern lines. And then, of course, south in Zaporizhia, we've got that Ukrainian salient and that little pocket that they were able to take during their counteroffensive towards Rabotna. Of course, Russia has an interest in closing that pocket and reclaiming the whole of the Surovikin line. This would close that salient from the counteroffensive and straighten out the line in the south. Now, Russia is likely going to have to make some choices in which of these different directions they choose to attack. Yes, they have a lot of forces, but so does Ukraine. And they're going to have to make choices on where they choose to mass their forces, get an overmatch over Ukrainian forces, and launch their attacks. We've seen so far in this war that both sides have chosen to attack across multiple areas, so they'll likely continue attacks on potentially all of these areas that I've listed, maybe even some more. However, where their main lines of effort are going to be, we'll just have to wait and see. I think that it would make some kind of sense for them to try to push to the Oskil River, because that geographic feature isn't necessarily far from where the line is right now. And if they were able to push forward towards the cities of Kupiansk or Liman, that could create a real dilemma and apply some pressure on those troops. And that is a pretty broad area of the front that would probably have some political implications. Now, ultimately, what Russia would probably be trying to do with these offensives isn't necessarily to create a breakthrough in the line and create basically a race to Kiev. And I don't think that in either case that's likely in either direction. I don't think either side will be able to quickly do that in any kind of realistic way. I think what they are more likely to try to do is to create some sort of a security dilemma, cause some sort of a military defeat, and that would apply more political pressure in Kiev and create more doubt on the current leadership in Kiev. I think we've seen this before in some of what, Ukrainian intelligence is saying that Russia's interests are. We talked about the, Maidan 3 and what Russia's current plan is in 2024 for Ukraine. So this is where we could see one of those potential military defeats if Russia is able to successfully prosecute its offensive, create a security dilemma, force Ukraine to fall back. That becomes, a defeat in that area for the Ukrainian military. And then, of course, Russian intelligence and clandestine assets can begin to spin up an information operation that, the Ukrainian leadership has failed and their military leadership is incompetent, and they're creating, challenges for themselves and they won't be able to win ultimately. Now, this could also have an inverse effect in Western Europe. We've seen French statements. We've seen Macron start to speak incredibly tough. However, since we've seen that, over this weekend, we've seen Macron actually walk back some of the statements, get a bit softer. We've seen, of course, and I talked about this in the previous video, French polling data that the French people aren't necessarily in favor of any kind of French or Western intervention in Ukraine. So it really becomes a question of political will in the West versus in Russia. And this is kind of the competition that Russia believes that it can win, where it goes to time and political will. And Russia doesn't believe that the West has it in them to stay in this thing long term. An offensive in Ukraine that happens over the next few weeks, months, or even year that is successful in putting the Ukrainian military in challenging positions and forcing the Ukrainian military to fall back in some areas, that might actually reinforce that narrative that they're trying to push out. Now, in either case, Ukraine's in for a very rough time. We've talked about the ammunition problems. We've talked about the potential political implications of a large-scale offensive by Russia. This is going to be a tough year for Ukraine in either case. And so it will require resilience amongst Ukraine and its allies to continue to train Ukrainian forces. We've talked about a potential Ukrainian mobilization, very politically polarizing in Ukraine. But it might have to happen if they're going to stabilize the lines. They just need more bodies, but they need more ammunition. That is very important. But their forces that are on the lines, they need rest. They need time to be rotated in and out. And that's ultimately where we're going to see a draft come in and probably, provide some sort of benefit for the Ukrainian military if it happens. However, with all that being said, I want to hear your thoughts on this because this is a complex topic. There's a lot that could happen here, and I want to know what you think. So leave me a comment down below. Leave a like if you found this video helpful or interesting, and I will talk to you all tomorrow.